Precision fuel and hydration is beginning to solidify its name in the world of endurance sport.
Precision fuel and hydration.
And today, we're going to discuss not only what happened in my race, but also how we're going to fix it. We're also going to discuss the evidence behind nutrition for Ironman beginners and those starting out. Clearly, after my Ironman, I'm not in any ballpark to be giving nutrition advice, so we're going to head over to Raf and the team down at Precision Fuel and Hydration, who are going to explain what went wrong and some beginner tips for those starting their Ironman journey. So let's briefly discuss what went wrong in my Ironman and how we're going to fix it. We just had Reese in to get another sweat test to compare our sweat test to the previous sweat test.
So I run my tests on behalf of Precision Hydration, so the guys in the UK. So my company, Sweat Testing Victoria, is the licensed tester here in Victoria. So I help athletes out like Brody to get their sweat composition, and then work there to give them personalised hydration planning to make sure they don't end up in the situation that you ended up last time.
So my number was 1,331 milligrams, which puts me pretty high on the sodium loss. Compared to the previous sweat test that I did, that showed that I lost 980 milligrams of sodium. But the main thing to take away here is that even though my sodium concentration is a lot higher than what we thought, although my sodium was still too high, I was still well and truly overhydrated considering my sweat loss and the weather conditions. And I also found out I had a few other issues with carb loading, but I'm gonna let the team at Precision Fuel and Hydration have a chat and speak about it.
Hey Brody, let's see if we can dive into your fueling and hydration strategy from your very first Ironman and see if we can optimize things a little bit going forwards so you don't make the same mistakes again. Diving straight into it, the first and probably the biggest mistake that you made during that first Ironman was having a set amount of sodium to consume each hour. Now within the body, sodium exists as a concentration relative to the amount of fluid that it's mixed in with. So you're constantly trying to balance sodium and fluid within your bloodstream. Sodium in particular has a few crucial roles during exercise, including fluid retention in the blood, as I just mentioned, muscle contraction, and carb absorption within your gut. It's also the most abundant electrolyte that you lose within your sweat, and that's why you might see white marks on some of your kit when you've been out sweating for a long time in the heat. Now, as I just mentioned, it's important to realise that sodium exists in a concentration, and so where you had a fixed amount per hour, but it wasn't quite as warm as you expected, you ended up drinking less and having the same amount of sodium, which meant the concentration was way out of whack and you were replacing it in a higher proportion to what you were losing. That's probably responsible for some of the issues that you experienced on race day. Okay, the second thing that probably went wrong for you on race day was actually your carb load in the build up to it. Now you told us that your carb load didn't look that different from your day-to-day diet, whereas what we'd actually want to see is a significant reduction in the amount of fats and fibres that you're eating and an increase in the proportion of carbs that you're eating relative to that. What that actually looks like, putting some numbers on it, is between 8 and 12 grams of carb per kilo of body weight for 2 consecutive days prior to your event. Now, that can be quite hard to visualise, so we've written out some menus as to what that looks like in terms of real food, and we'll link to that helpful blog in the description below. And the third main thing that went wrong for you on race day was actually your carb target. You were aiming for 60 grams of carb per hour, which, when using your glucose-only gels at the time, was an appropriate target for you. However, by changing the fuel source slightly and introducing some fructose as well, you're able to significantly increase your carb target up towards 75 or 90 grams of carb per hour without any added GI distress. Now, aiming for 75 or 90 grams of carb per hour shouldn't be a shift that happens overnight. You can slowly build your way up to those high intakes by training your gut to tolerate them comfortably. It's quite hard to visualize how you might do that, so I've left another helpful blog in the description below.
So as you can tell, I got a lot to work on, and I'm very excited that I now have a really decent plan heading forward and how I can improve my Ironman nutrition strategy. But let's head back to Precision Fuel and Hydration, and they're going to explain a little bit more about Ironman nutrition.
In general, for any endurance activity, but in particular Ironman triathlon, we would split the planning of your nutrition strategy into 3 key levers which you can pull upon at any one time. That's your fluid, your electrolyte, and your carbohydrate. Lever number 1 is your fluid intake. How much you drink back is really dependent on how much fluid you're losing in the first place. And we all lose slightly different amounts of fluid depending on our sweat rates. You'll have seen this firsthand when someone at the end of an activity looks like they need a bucket and mop, and the other person looks like they've not even started yet. What we're seeing there is individual differences in sweat rates, and you can measure this pretty easily at home. You can measure your sweat rate super easily at home using just a set of bathroom scales. The process is, hop on the scales before your activity, holding any bottles or gels that you're going to eat or drink during that session. Ideally you do that nude, just because bib shorts can hold quite a lot of sweat weight. You do your session, let's say today we've got a 1 hour turbo. Afterwards, I'm going to make sure I'm fully dried off, again ideally nude, and I'm going to hold those empty bottles, empty gel packets. On the scales, any weight difference that I see in kilos is going to be very closely equivalent to what I've lost in sweat in litres. So say that 1 hour session, I've lost 1.5 kilos. My sweat rate on that day, in those conditions, is 1.5 litres an hour. That doesn't all of a sudden mean that you need to start drinking back 1.5 litres of fluid per hour. That could get pretty uncomfortable, especially if it's a really long or hot session. All it does give you is a ballpark figure of exactly how much you're losing in that hour, and so an idea of how much roughly to start drinking back. Generally, the science would recommend we avoid accumulating dehydration to the point where we've lost between 2 and 4% of our body weight because of sweat. That's where performance decline starts occurring. So what we can do is take your sweat rate and work out roughly how much of that you need to drink back for a session so you can avoid crossing that 2% threshold. Lever number 2 is your electrolyte intake. You're never sweating plain water, and it's important to remember that sodium is the most abundant electrolyte that we lose in our sweat. As I mentioned earlier, it plays quite a few key roles in exercise, and so replacing in proportion to what you're losing it in is super important. As a company, we've done over 15,000 sweat tests up till now, so we know that on the low end, people can lose as little as 200 milligrams of sodium per litre that they sweat, and on the higher end, over 2,000. That's a tenfold difference from one person to the next, and so their hydration strategy is going to be personalised to them. For Brody, he went and got his sweat tested with Reese, and we know that he loses just over 1,300 milligrams of sodium per litre. That means when he's replacing it, he should use a combination of the pH 1000 strength products and the pH 1500 strength products to match his losses. As a company, we've done those 15,000 sweat tests and understand that the average losses are just over 1,000 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. So a sensible place to start in your hydration strategy would be to pick up a pH 1000 strength product so that you can replace in proportion to the average losses. If you really want to dial this in for yourself, you can check out the link below, which is a map of our sweat test centres near you. Now the third lever is our carb intake. We'll focus on carbohydrate for fueling because it's the most readily available energy source for our muscles to use during high intensity activity like racing an Ironman. We focus on this over fats or proteins because they would require us to slow right down and provide the body with more oxygen so that they can process them into a usable form of energy for the muscles to use. The general relationship between carbohydrate and performance in the scientific literature is that the more you eat, the better your performance is, up until the point where GI distress takes over and you have to slow down because you're uncomfortable. So, typically, we'd aim for somewhere between 75 and 90 grams of carb per hour for an Ironman. You will see some people in the pro field hitting far higher intakes than that, up to 120 or 130 grams of carb per hour. They've done a lot of work to train their gut to tolerate those intakes at race pace, and it doesn't happen overnight. There's one aspect of your nutrition strategy which we've not spoken about just yet, and that's caffeine. It doesn't make up one of our 3 key levers because not everybody should use it, as there's quite a lot of variance in individual tolerability. However, caffeine is one of the very few legal substances which has been proven to improve sports performance by lowering your perceived effort and increasing your focus. Because around 90% of adults use caffeine to some degree every day, and it's the world's most popular drug, we can dive into the details a little bit. The first step is that you practice with caffeine during your training sessions to make sure that you can tolerate it individually. And then there's 3 real considerations for how to incorporate it best on race day. Number 1 is knowing that it lasts a bloody long time in your body. It's got a half-life of between 4 and 5 hours in most people, which means if I took a caffeine gel at 10 AM, by 3 PM, half of that caffeine is still circulating in my bloodstream, and by 8 PM that evening, a quarter of the caffeine is still present in my blood. The second thing is how much you should actually take. Now, the science recommends an optimal dose of somewhere between 3 and 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo of your body weight for something like an Ironman, and that's across the race. For me, at 70 kilos, 3 milligrams per kilo would be 210 milligrams of caffeine, and 6 would be 420. For context, a regular double shot coffee should have between 100 and 150 milligrams of caffeine in, and most caffeinated sports products normally sit around 100 milligrams, just like our gels. The third caffeine consideration is the tactical timing of your intake. It actually takes around 45 minutes for caffeine to peak in your blood, and so you don't want to take it too late on in the run course where you've only got 2 kilometers left and all you'll be doing is fueling the after party. But what you might want to do is time it 45 minutes before your main climb on the bike course, for example. But it's important to circle back and remember that if caffeine doesn't work for you, that's not the end of the world. Making sure that you get your carb, fluid and sodium right will be the backbone of your fuel and hydration strategy, and caffeine is just an added bonus.
So another thing I found out that I did very poorly in my last Ironman prep was fueling strategies. So let's head back to the team at Precision Fuel and Hydration, and let's speak about how we can implement our fueling strategies during our workouts, at what intensity, and also what are some fueling strategies throughout the week and what we can use instead of using gels.
It's important for beginner triathletes to know that straight off the bat, you don't need to go to the shops and spend hundreds of dollars on sports nutrition products. Initially, you can use carbohydrate-rich real foods like cereal bars, jelly snakes or Haribo to fuel your training sessions. But it is really important, the closer you get to your event, to allow your body to tolerate exactly what you expect it to be able to on race day. That's things like gels or drink mixes, because your gut actually adapts physiologically to the exact ratio of carbs that you're going to provide it with. That can happen as quickly as 2 weeks, but most gut training protocols last around 10 weeks so that you have a really comfortable race day and actually have the opportunity to enjoy yourself. It is worth noting that while real foods, i.e. anything that's not sports nutrition, can play a role in the initial phases of training, sports nutrition products have been designed specifically to be easily tolerated and easily broken down within your body. That means when you're aiming for higher ends of the carb recommendations closer to your event, you should lean closer to sports nutrition products rather than foods, because there's less risk of GI distress.
So just a quick summary for the team at Precision Fuel and Hydration. What are your top 5 tips in order to fuel for an Ironman?
The first of my 5 top tips is definitely to make sure that you're having the right amount of fluid on race day. Dehydration is one of the leading causes of DNFs at Ironman events, and over drinking fluid can cause some pretty nasty conditions. The best way to start is by getting an idea of your sweat rate by doing some sweat rate testing, and then understand how you can avoid crossing the 2 to 4% dehydration threshold, which will lead to performance decline and could potentially lead to DNFing. Tip number 2, which leads on from how much you should drink, is what you should put within those drinks. Electrolyte intake is really crucial for performance during very long and very hot events. The best way to find out exactly how much you lose and therefore what you should drink back is by having a sweat test like Brody, but a good place to start in the meantime is picking up something like the pH 1000, which replaces the average losses. Tip number 3 takes us to before the race has even started. We spoke briefly about carb loading when we went through what went wrong for Brody during his first race. Now, the important thing with carb loading is that you hit the right amount of fuel in the 2 days before the race and on the morning of. That means that you'll arrive, your energy stores full and ready for action. The other side of this coin is arriving optimally hydrated, and it's a mistake that loads of triathletes make. If you simply drink lots of plain water because you want to start hydrated, your body hasn't got enough electrolyte within the blood plasma to retain all of that fluid. And the only way that it can balance it out is by peeing out loads of plain water. That's part of the reason why the lines for the Portaloos are 45 minutes long at any race you'll go to. The simple way to combat this is by having a really strong electrolyte drink, like the pH 1500, the night before with your dinner and the morning of with your breakfast, so that you arrive not needing to pee, but also with optimal hydration status. Number 4, while carbs, fluid and electrolytes make up the bulk of any good Ironman nutrition strategy, it's well worth looking into caffeine too. That's because it's one of the very few legal things that have been proven to improve sports performance, and it does that by reducing your perceived exertion and increasing your focus. Although it's worth remembering, not everyone gets along with caffeine the same way, so it's definitely worth trialling it in training before the big day. And finally, tip number 5, that's fueling for the work required. Typically, for something like an Ironman, we'd recommend hitting 75 to 90 grams of carb per hour. While that can seem a lot at first, you can easily train your gut to tolerate that amount and have a really comfortable race day. Those targets are true whether you're aiming to finish in 8 hours or 16 hours at your next race. Those were my 5 top tips for nailing your fuel and hydration strategy at your next Ironman race. If you've still got any questions, like how on earth do I carry all of this stuff, then that's great. We offer a free online one-to-one video consultation service where you can hop on a call and chat to one of our experts about anything to do with your fueling and hydration strategy.
So thank you everyone for watching. This was a massive shock to me and I'm really glad that now I've got an insane nutrition plan that I can follow, and hopefully this time everything just goes to plan and we can keep training and hopefully try and get the nutrition to the best we can, and we can train and enjoy it and practice these nutrition strategies. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you guys on the channel.